July 28, 1942. The Kalmyk Steppe, southern Russia. The mercury in the thermometer cracked past 90 degrees Fahrenheit as Unteroffizier Erich Klaus wiped a mixture of grease and pulverized earth from his goggles. Sitting atop the scorched hull of his Panzer IV, the commander squinted into the shimmering heat haze that distorted the horizon, turning the endless grassy plains into a vibrating ocean of yellow and brown. The roar of the Maybach engine beneath him was a constant, deafening companion that vibrated through his boots and into his very bones, a mechanical heartbeat driving them deeper into the void. Beside the treads, infantrymen from the Sixth Army marched with heads bowed low, their grey uniforms stained white with the pervasive dust that coated their lungs and clogged their rifles. There was no enemy in sight today, only the oppressive sun and the terrifying vastness of a land that seemed to swallow armies whole without leaving a trace. This march into the burning cauldron of the steppe was the direct result of a monumental shift in strategy that had occurred months prior in the Wolf's Lair. Adolf Hitler had turned his gaze away from the spires of Moscow, which had eluded him the previous winter, and fixed his obsession on the industrial arteries of the south. The new directive was codenamed Operation Blue, a massive pincer movement designed to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and sever the Volga River, the vital lifeline of Joseph Stalin's war machine. It was a gamble of immense proportions that required the Wehrmacht to cover thousands of miles of hostile terrain, stretching their supply lines until they were as thin and brittle as spun glass. The plan relied on speed, shock, and the assumption that the Red Army was a broken force, incapable of mounting another strategic reserve after the brutal losses of the previous year. The fatal error that would ultimately doom Erich Klaus and 300,000 of his comrades began not on the battlefield, but over a map table at headquarters. In a moment of supreme overconfidence, the German High Command decided to split Army Group South into two diverging forces, violating the cardinal military principle of concentration of force. Army Group A was sent south to capture the oil wealth of Baku, while Army Group B, spearheaded by the elite Sixth Army, was ordered to march east toward the city that bore the Soviet dictator's name. This decision tore the German offensive capability in half, creating a massive, widening gap between the two armies that the Soviets would watch with growing interest. As the panzers rolled forward, they were not just advancing toward a city, they were marching away from their support, isolating themselves in a pocket of their own making. Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, was a man chosen for his meticulous nature rather than his battlefield intuition. A staff officer by trade, Paulus was accustomed to the clean logic of war games and the orderly precision of operational maps, not the chaotic friction of the front lines. He sat in his mobile headquarters, staring at the blue arrows marking his advance, feeling the pressure of history weighing on his shoulders. He was a perfectionist who followed orders with rigid obedience, a trait that would prove disastrous in the months to come. His orders were to take Stalingrad, blocking the Volga to stop the flow of oil and supplies to central Russia. It seemed like a straightforward objective on paper, a final crowning glory for a summer campaign that was supposed to end the war in the East once and for all. However, the reality on the ground was far different from the clean lines drawn on Paulus's maps. As the Sixth Army pushed deeper into the Don Bend, they encountered a logistical nightmare that threatened to stall the offensive before it reached the city. The railways in the captured territories had to be re-gauged to fit German trains, a slow and agonizing process that left the frontline troops starving for fuel and ammunition. Trucks broke down by the thousands on the primitive dirt roads, their axles snapped by the ruts and their engines choked by the dust. The Luftwaffe struggled to airlift supplies to the forward units, a foreshadowing of the catastrophe that would unfold later in the winter. Every gallon of gasoline that reached the tanks at the spearhead had travelled through a gauntlet of partisans and endless miles of empty steppe, making every mile forward a victory of logistics over geography. The Soviet resistance during this phase was perplexing to the German commanders who were used to the rigid defensive lines of the past. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, commanding the Soviet fronts in the south, had learned the bitter lessons of 1941 and was no longer willing to sacrifice entire armies in static pockets. Instead of standing and dying where they stood, the Red Army began to conduct a fighting retreat, trading the vast space of the Russian interior for precious time. German tank crews would punch through a defensive line only to find empty trenches and abandoned villages, the enemy having melted away into the tall grass before the trap could snap shut. This elusive tactic frustrated the Germans, who craved a decisive battle of annihilation, known as a Kesselschlacht, to break the Soviet will. As August arrived, the heat intensified, and the landscape began to change from the flat steppe to the treacherous ravines and gullies leading to the Volga. These natural trenches, known locally as bulkers, provided ideal cover for Soviet anti-tank teams and mortar crews who began to harass the German flanks with increasing ferocity. The easy marching was over, replaced by a grinding advance where every village had to be cleared house by house. The Sixth Army was still winning tactical engagements, pushing the Soviets back toward the river. But the cost in men and material was rising steadily. The infantry divisions, which made up the bulk of Paulus's force, were exhausted from marching hundreds of miles on foot, their boots worn through and their bodies gaunt from dysentery and lack of fresh water. It was during this approach that the German High Command made another critical miscalculation regarding their flanks. To cover the hundreds of miles of open ground created by the advance, the Germans relied heavily on Allied armies from Romania, Hungary, and Italy to guard the rear and the flanks of the Sixth Army. These units were poorly equipped compared to their German counterparts, lacking heavy anti-tank weapons, modern artillery, and sufficient motorized transport. They were brave soldiers, but they were being asked to hold massive sectors of the front against a Soviet war machine that was rapidly modernizing. The German generals looked at these Allied units with a mix of disdain and wishful thinking, assuming the Soviets were too weak to exploit the obvious weakness in the line. By late August, the spires and factory chimneys of Stalingrad finally appeared on the horizon, shimmering like a mirage through the heat and smoke. To the soldiers of the Sixth Army, the city represented the finish line, the final obstacle before they could find winter quarters and rest. They did not see a fortress. They seen a sprawling industrial center stretching for miles along the western bank of the Volga. The mood in the ranks was a mix of exhaustion and renewed optimism. Driven by the propaganda that claimed the Red Army was on its last legs, they believed that one final, violent push would shatter the defenders and hand them the city within days. Photographs from this time show soldiers smiling, posing with signposts pointing to Stalingrad, unaware they were standing at the gates of hell. On August 23, 1942, the true nature of the coming battle was revealed in a cataclysm of fire and steel. General Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 unleashed a massive air armada against the city, the largest single bombardment on the Eastern Front since the invasion began. Hundreds of Heinkel bombers and Stuka dive bombers blackened the sky, raining thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries onto the residential districts and industrial complexes. The city, built largely of wood in its center, was instantly transformed into a raging inferno. The fires burned so intensely that the updrafts tossed heavy bombers around like toys, and the smoke plume was visible from 40 miles away. The Sixth Army watched from the heights, cheering the display of overwhelming firepower. However, this massive bombardment was a double-edged sword that would come back to haunt the invaders in the weeks to follow. While the airstrikes killed roughly 40,000 civilians and destroyed the city's infrastructure, they also inadvertently created the perfect defensive terrain for the Red Army. The neat streets and wooden buildings were reduced to mountains of jagged rubble, twisted steel, and broken masonry. Turning every block into a fortress and every cellar into a bunker, the German panzers, masters of open maneuver warfare, would find themselves paralyzed in this landscape of debris, unable to traverse the ruined streets. The Luftwaffe had destroyed the city, but in doing so, they had built a fortress for the defenders that no tank could penetrate. Inside the burning city, the Soviet 62nd Army was preparing for a fight to the death, bolstered by the ruthlessness of the Stalinist regime. Order No. 227 had been issued, famously commanding, "Not a step back," and declaring that any retreat without orders was a crime punishable by execution. Blocking detachments from the NKVD were set up at the river crossings. Machine guns trained on their own troops to prevent desertion. The terrified civilians were initially forbidden to evacuate, Stalin, believing their presence would force the soldiers to fight harder. The stage was set for a confrontation where human life held zero value, and the only metric of success was the number of meters held or lost. As the German vanguard, the 16th Panzer Division, raced to the northern suburbs to cut off the city from the north, they reached the banks of the Volga near the tractor factory. The tank crews climbed out of their hatches, gazing at the wide, sluggish river that marked the border between Europe and Asia. They took photographs and laughed, believing they had effectively won the battle by reaching the objective. They could see the ferries crossing the river, carrying reinforcements into the burning city, but they assumed their artillery would soon sink them. They did not realize that reaching the river was the easy part. Holding it against an enemy with nowhere left to run was an entirely different proposition. The strategic blindness at the highest levels continued to plague the operation even as the first street battles began. Hitler, emboldened by the initial success of reaching the Volga, began stripping units away from the Stalingrad sector to send them to Leningrad or the Caucasus. Believing the city was already as good as taken, he ignored the intelligence reports detailing the massive buildup of Soviet reserves on the opposite bank of the river and the precarious position of the elongated German flanks. This arrogance filtered down to the divisional commanders, who pushed their men into the city without securing their rear. Eager to claim the glory of capturing Stalin's city, the trap had been set not by a single brilliant maneuver, but by a series of German choices that prioritized symbolism over strategy and arrogance over logistics. The Sixth Army had marched deeper into the funnel, their eyes fixed on the burning horizon, ignoring the darkness gathering at their sides. As the sun set on that late August day, the fires of Stalingrad illuminated the faces of the German soldiers, casting long, dancing shadows that looked disturbingly like skeletons. The war of movement was over. The rat war was about to begin. The open steppe, where the Wehrmacht was master, lay behind them. Ahead lay only ruins, cellars, and a kind of warfare for which no manual had ever been written. September 1942 brought a change to the air over Stalingrad that tasted of ash and pulverized brick. The once thriving metropolis had been reduced to a jagged skeleton of its former self, a labyrinth of broken walls and twisted steel that stretched for 20 miles along the Volga. For the soldiers of the German Sixth Army, the open horizons of the steppe were now a distant memory, replaced by a claustrophobic nightmare where the sky was visible only as a sliver of grey smoke above the ruins. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Europe, had slammed into the immovable object of the city and shattered. Here, speed meant nothing, and the vaunted tactical superiority of the Wehrmacht was suffocated by millions of tons of debris. The German infantrymen, who had once marched confidently with sleeves rolled up in the summer sun, coined a new term for this savage form of combat, Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. It was a fitting name for a battle that had descended into the sewers, cellars, and gutted factories of the industrial district. The front line was no longer a line on a map, but a chaotic mess that ran through the middle of living rooms and across factory floors. A German squad might hold the kitchen of a crumbled apartment block while Soviet soldiers held the bedroom. The two sides separated only by a thin wall and the terrifying knowledge of each other's presence. Sleep became impossible as the fear of a grenade rolling through a hole in the floorboards kept every man's nerves stretched to the breaking point. The panzers, the iron fist of the German military, found themselves effectively neutered in this concrete jungle. In the open fields, a Panzer IV was a predator, but here in the narrow, rubble-choked streets, it was merely a large, blind target. The mountains of debris prevented the tanks from lowering their guns to engage infantry hiding in basements, while the twisted girders and masonry blocked their advance at every turn. Soviet anti-tank teams, hiding in the upper stories of bombed-out buildings, rained Molotov cocktails and fire from anti-tank rifles down onto the thin top armor of the German vehicles. The terrified tank crews kept their hatches locked tight, suffocating in the heat and fumes, knowing that to open them was to invite a sniper's bullet. On the Soviet side, the defense of the city fell to the 62nd Army, a battered force that seemed on the verge of collapse. However, in mid-September, a new commander arrived who would change the course of the battle. General Vasily Chuikov was a man of iron will and ruthless pragmatism. known for his rough demeanor and his refusal to retreat. Upon taking command, he famously declared that there was no land for them beyond the Volga, effectively burning the bridges for himself and his men. Choykov understood that he could not defeat the Germans in a conventional battle of maneuver, so he devised a tactic that would turn the German advantages into liabilities. Choykov ordered his troops to employ a tactic he called hugging the enemy. The premise was simple and suicidal. Soviet soldiers were to keep their positions no more than 50 yards from the German lines at all times. By staying this close, the Red Army neutralized the Luftwaffe and the German artillery, which were the Wehrmacht's greatest assets. German pilots circling overhead could not bomb Soviet positions without risking killing their own men, and artillery observers could not call in heavy barrages for the same reason. This tactic forced the Germans to fight with small arms and grenades, a brutal contest of attrition where the Soviet soldiers' ferocity and willingness to die gave them the edge. The fighting for the Stalingrad Central Railway Station, no. One exemplified the insanity of this new kind of warfare. The station changed hands 14 times in a single week, becoming a slaughterhouse where battalions evaporated in a matter of hours. Assault groups from both sides would charge through the smoke, firing submachine guns from the hip, grappling in hand-to-hand combat over ticket counters and waiting rooms. The floor was slick with blood and covered in a carpet of spent shell casings. Yet neither side would yield. At night, the station was illuminated by the eerie glow of flares and the muzzle flashes of thousands of weapons, creating a strobe light effect that revealed scenes of utter carnage. South of the city centre stood the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure that loomed over the landscape like a fortress. Inside, a small detachment of Soviet naval infantry and militia held out for days against an entire German division. The concrete walls were so thick that German artillery shells simply bounced off, and the tanks could not elevate their guns high enough to hit the defenders firing from the upper vents. The fighting inside the elevator was horrific, fought in absolute darkness amidst the choking dust of burning grain. The defenders, cut off from water and food, fought until they were burned out by flamethrowers or buried under the rubble, their resistance buying precious time for the river crossings. Dominating the city's geography was Mamayev Kurgan, a burial mound labelled on military maps as Hill 102. Whoever controlled this height controlled the city, as it offered a clear line of sight to the Volga crossings and the city centre. The hill became the focal point of the most intense artillery duels of the war, its shape literally changing as thousands of shells ploughed the earth day after day. The soil on Mamayev Kurgan was so saturated with metal that a handful of dirt scooped up would contain more shrapnel than earth. Assaults up the slopes were suicidal charges into a wall of machine gun fire. Yet wave after wave of men from both sides were thrown into the meat grinder to capture the summit. The daily reality for the German soldier had shifted from the euphoria of victory to a grim determination to survive. The letters home from this period began to change in tone, losing the confident swagger of the summer and replaced by a dark fatalism. They wrote of the red devils who would not die, of the constant thirst, and of the noise that never stopped. The psychological toll was immense. Men aged years in a matter of weeks, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollowed out by the 1,000-yard stare. They were the masters of Europe, yet they were being bled white by an enemy they considered subhuman, in a city that had ceased to exist. The Soviet snipers added a layer of psychological terror that paralyzed the German movements during the daylight hours. Men like Vasily Zaitsev became legends, not just for their kill counts, but for the way they made the Germans feel hunted in their own lines. A German soldier could not fetch water, move to a latrine, or even light a cigarette without risking a bullet between the eyes. The rubble provided millions of hiding spots, from a cracked chimney to a pile of rags, making it impossible to clear an area completely. The fear of the invisible marksman eroded morale, forcing the Germans to move like rats, scurrying from cover to cover in the shadows. As the battle dragged on, the German tactical approach degenerated into the use of Sturmgruppen, or assault groups. These were small, heavily armed teams equipped with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and sharpened spades for close-quarters killing. They would clear a building room by room, throwing grenades before bursting in to spray the interior with automatic fire. Sometimes, the battle for a single large building, like the Uvermag department store or the Pavlov's house, would last for weeks. The Germans would capture the ground floor, while the Soviets held the basement and the upper floors, engaging in a vertical war through holes blasted in the ceilings. To sustain the defense, the Soviet supply line relied on the current of death, the hazardous crossing of the Volga River. Every night, a flotilla of ferries, fishing boats, and barges would brave the German artillery and air attacks to bring reinforcements and ammunition to the West Bank and evacuate the wounded to the east. The river churned with explosions, the water turning red with blood and black with oil. Thousands of soldiers drowned before they ever set foot in the city, their heavy coats pulling them under the freezing water. Yet, the lifeline held, ensuring that the 62nd Army always had just enough men and bullets to continue the struggle for one more day. One of the most critical moments came in late September, when the German advance threatened to break through to the central landing stage, which would have cut the Soviet defense in two. In a desperate move, the Soviet command threw the elite 13th Guards Rifle Division, commanded by General Alexander Rodimptsev, across the river in broad daylight. The guardsmen charged off the boats and straight into the German machine guns, taking 50% casualties in the first 24 hours. However, their suicidal bravery pushed the Germans back from the riverbank, stabilizing the line and saving the 62nd Army from immediate annihilation. The Luftwaffe, while neutralized in the close-quarters fighting, continued to pound the rear areas and the river crossings with relentless fury. General von Richthofen, frustrated by the lack of progress, ordered his Stukas to fly continuously from dawn until dusk. The screech of the dive bombers' sirens became the soundtrack of Stalingrad, a psychological weapon designed to break the will of the defenders. But the rubble that the bombs created only improved the defensive positions of the Soviets. Every collapsed wall created a new barricade. Every crater became a foxhole. The Germans were effectively bombing themselves out of a victory, destroying the very infrastructure they needed to maneuver. By mid-October, the battle had devolved into a stalemate of grotesque proportions. The German 6th Army had captured 90% of the city, but the remaining 10%, a thin strip of land along the Volga bank, remained firmly in Soviet hands. Paulus found his army heavily committed, his reserves exhausted, and his flanks dangerously exposed. Yet the order from Berlin remained unchanged: take the city at all costs. The strategic objective of cutting the oil route had been achieved by fire control over the river, but the obsession with the symbol of Stalingrad had blinded Hitler to the reality. The German army was no longer fighting for a strategic goal, they were fighting for a graveyard. As October settled over the Eastern Front, a dangerous psychological shift occurred within the concrete bunkers of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Adolf Hitler, staring at the operational maps spread before him, ceased to view Stalingrad as a strategic objective and began to see it as a test of personal will between himself and Joseph Stalin. The original goal of the campaign to sever the Volga transport route and seize the Caucasian oil had effectively been achieved by the guns of the 6th Army dominating the river. Yet, the German dictator became fixated on the capture of the city itself, demanding the conquest of every last block and sewer pipe. He famously declared in a speech at the Berlin Sportpalast that no power on earth would push the German army away from the Volga, a boast that transformed a military operation into a political trap from which there could be no retreat. This obsession trickled down the chain of command, forcing General Paulus to feed his remaining battalions into the meat grinder of the Northern Industrial District. The battle moved away from the residential center and into the titanic factory complexes that lined the riverbank: the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Red October steel works. These were not mere buildings, they were fortresses of steel and concrete, sprawling over miles of ground, filled with heavy machinery that provided perfect cover for the defenders. The fighting here was savage and three-dimensional, taking place on the rooftops, amidst the twisted girders of the factory floors, and deep within the subterranean drainage tunnels. The Germans were forced to conquer these complexes, shed by shed, often losing an entire company to capture a single workshop that would be retaken by the Soviets the following night. Inside the Red October steel works, the environment was apocalyptic, a landscape of twisted metal bathed in the eerie light of flares and burning oil. The artillery fire was so intense that the factory roofs had collapsed, creating a jagged maze of debris where snipers and machine gun nests could remain hidden until the enemy was within arm's reach. The German infantry, depleted and exhausted, described the fighting as a contest of grenades and sharpened spades, where the dust was so thick it clogged their weapons and coated their eyes. They were fighting for piles of slag and ruined machinery, paying a butcher's bill for territory that held no tactical value other than the fact that it bore the name of the enemy leader. The Sixth Army was bleeding to death by 1,000 cuts, its combat power eroding with every metre of ground gained in the factory district. While the Sixth Army mesmerized itself with the brutal frontal assaults in the city, a catastrophic vulnerability was developing on its flanks. To concentrate enough combat power to take the city, Paulus had been forced to strip his flanks of German divisions, replacing them with Allied units from Romania, Italy, and Hungary. To the northwest of the city, along the Don River, the Romanian Third Army was tasked with holding a front of nearly 100 miles. These soldiers were brave but woefully ill-equipped for modern warfare against a mechanized enemy. They lacked heavy anti-tank guns, relying on obsolete 37mm weapons that the Germans derisively called door knockers because they could only scratch the paint of a Soviet T-34 tank. Their morale was low, their rations were poor, and they were treated with thinly veiled contempt by their German allies. General Petre Dumitrescu, the commander of the Romanian Third Army, was acutely aware of the impending disaster and sent repeated warnings to Army Group B headquarters. He reported seeing massive Soviet concentrations building up on the bridgeheads across the Don, accompanied by the ominous rumble of tank engines at night. He pleaded for German anti-tank reserves and mines to bolster his fragile lines, arguing that his troops were stretched so thin they could not possibly stop a concerted attack. His warnings were dismissed by the German High Command, who were blinded by their own propaganda and the belief that the Red Army was a spent force, incapable of a major offensive. The Germans referred to these Allied sectors as corset staves, stiffeners to hold the line, while the real fighting happened in Stalingrad. Ignoring the fact that the corset was about to snap, in the German rear areas, the logistics situation was becoming critical as the winter approached. Yet the preparations for the freezing temperatures were dangerously inadequate. The obsession with hauling ammunition to the front to feed the street battles meant that winter clothing and heating fuel were left behind at railheads hundreds of miles away. Soldiers in the frontline foxholes were still wearing their summer uniforms, shivering in the biting autumn winds that swept across the steppe. Frostbite began to claim toes and fingers, a silent enemy that took men out of the line just as effectively as a Soviet bullet. The Luftwaffe, already overstretched, struggled to bring in supplies, prioritizing shells over blankets, a decision that prioritized killing the enemy over keeping the German army alive. Meanwhile, behind the Soviet lines, a deception operation of massive scale, known as Maskirovka, was underway. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky were orchestrating a master plan to exploit the very weakness the Germans were ignoring. Under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence, the Soviets moved hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and massive amounts of artillery into the forests and ravines opposite the Romanian flanks. They built underwater bridges across the Don to hide their movements from German reconnaissance planes and moved only at night with lights extinguished. The German intelligence service, Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, failed to detect the scale of this build-up, interpreting the movements they did see as local relief operations rather than preparations for a strategic counter-offensive. General Paulus, sitting in his headquarters at Golubinsky, was a man slowly disintegrating under the immense pressure of his command. He had developed a nervous tic in his face and suffered from chronic dysentery, a physical manifestation of the stress of sending thousands of men to their deaths daily. He was a staff officer who revered the chain of command, and although he saw the danger on his flanks, he lacked the moral courage to defy Hitler's direct orders to focus everything on the city. He requested reserves to shore up the Romanians, but when Berlin refused, he acquiesced, burying himself in the minutiae of the street fighting rather than addressing the strategic doom looming over his army. He was a prisoner of his own obedience, leading his army into an abyss because he could not imagine disobeying an order. By early November, the German Sixth Army had captured 90% of Stalingrad. pushing the Soviet 62nd Army into a few narrow strips of land along the Volga bank. The Germans reached the river at several points, splitting the Soviet defense into isolated pockets that had to be supplied individually by boat. The propaganda machine in Berlin trumpeted these successes, printing headlines that the city had fallen and that the final victory was days away. Hitler promoted the idea that the battle was won, creating a false reality that made any talk of withdrawal or defensive posturing seem like treasonous defeatism. The German public was told that the fall of Stalingrad was imminent, setting them up for a shock that would shake the foundations of the Third Reich. The tactical situation in the factories had devolved into a surreal nightmare where the front lines were often defined by piles of rubble or twisted pipes. In the Barricadi gun factory, German pioneer battalions used flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear the workshops, but the Soviets would simply infiltrate back in through the sewer system at night. The tennis racket, a loop of railway lines near the chemical plant, became a killing ground where entire battalions were ground down to company strength in days. The German soldiers, once the proud conquerors of Europe, were now haggard, dirty figures resembling the rats they claimed to be fighting. They lived in holes in the ground, drank water from shell craters, and lived in constant fear of the sniper's bullet. The neglect of the flanks was not just a tactical oversight, it was a symptom of the racism that permeated the Nazi ideology and military planning. The German commanders fundamentally underestimated the Untermensch subhuman Soviets, refusing to believe they were capable of organizing a complex, large-scale armored operation. They also looked down on their Romanian allies, treating them as cannon fodder rather than integral parts of the defensive line. This arrogance led to a fatal complacency, where reports of Soviet tank engines were dismissed as training exercises, and the concerns of Romanian generals were brushed aside as cowardice. The Wehrmacht believed its own myth of invincibility, even as the evidence of a gathering storm became undeniable. On the northern flank, opposite the Romanian Third Army, the Soviet 5th Tank Army under General Romanenko was quietly moving its T-34 seconds into their jump-off positions. These tanks were painted white to blend in with the first snows of winter, rendering them invisible to the few German reconnaissance patrols that ventured out. The Soviet tankers were fresh, well-equipped, and burning with a desire for revenge after the humiliations of the previous summer. They knew exactly who was facing them across the line, the poorly equipped Romanians, and they knew that once they punched through that brittle shell, the soft underbelly of the 6th Army would be wide open. The hammer was raised, poised to strike a blow that would resonate through history. As the middle of November approached, the weather took a turn for the worse, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow beginning to cover the ravaged landscape. For the Germans, this marked the beginning of their greatest misery. For the Soviets, it was an ally. The frozen ground hardened the mud, making it possible for tanks to maneuver off-road, effectively ending the Rasputitsa mud season that had hampered mobility. The timing was perfect for the Soviet counteroffensive. The 6th Army was fully committed in the city. Its reserves were non-existent. Its soldiers were exhausted, and its flanks were guarded by troops who were already shivering in the cold, lacking both the will and the weapons to fight a tank war. The final irony of this phase of the battle was that the Germans were tactically winning the fight for the city, while strategically losing the war for the region. They had pushed Chuikov's men to the brink of annihilation. The Soviet bridgeheads were measured in mere yards, and the 62nd Army was running out of ammunition and men. If the battle had continued as a simple contest of attrition within the city limits, the Germans might eventually have pushed the last Soviet soldier into the Volga. But by focusing their entire gaze on the ruins, they had turned their backs on the vast steppe behind them, unaware that the jaws of the trap were about to snap shut. On the night of November 18, 1942, a heavy fog settled over the Don River Valley, dampening sound and reducing visibility to near zero. In the Romanian trenches, sentries peered nervously into the grey mist, listening to the strange, metallic grinding noises drifting across the frozen river. They gripped their rifles with frozen fingers, sensing that something terrible was coming, something against which their meager defenses would be useless. Inside the city, the German assault troops cleaned their weapons for another day of house-to-house fighting. Unaware that they were already walking dead men, the fatal obsession had done its work. The The Sixth Army was exactly where Stalin wanted it. November 19, 1942, dawned with a suffocating blanket of freezing fog that smothered the steppes northwest of Stalingrad, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. In the trenches of the Romanian Third Army, soldiers huddled in their greatcoats, stamping their boots against the frozen earth to keep the circulation flowing in their numb toes. The silence was absolute and unnerving, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the dry steppe grass and the occasional clink of a rifle bolt. They were unaware that just a few miles away, thousands of tank engines were idling, their exhaust plumes merging with the mist. As the Soviet Fifth Tank Army prepared to unleash hell, at 0720 hours, the order siren was transmitted across the Soviet radio networks, and the silence was shattered by a noise that sounded like the tearing of the sky itself. 3,500 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously, a barrage of such intensity that it physically shook the ground for miles around. The terrifying screech of the Katyusha rocket launchers, known to the Germans as Stalin's organs, joined the chorus, raining high explosives down on the fragile Romanian positions. The psychological impact was devastating. The earth erupted in geysers of black soil and snow, burying men alive in their foxholes and severing telephone lines instantly. The bombardment lasted for 80 minutes, a calculated duration designed to stun the defenders and destroy their fortifications before the first tank tread crossed the line. When the shelling finally lifted, the dazed survivors looked out into the fog to see a nightmare emerging from the white gloom. Out of the mist rolled waves of T-34 and KV-1 tanks, painted white to match the snow, looking like ghostly predators as they crushed the barbed wire beneath their tracks. Riding on the back of the tanks were Soviet submachine gunners, the tank descent, their white camouflage capes fluttering in the wind as they sprayed the trenches with automatic fire. The Romanian soldiers fought with desperate courage, manning their obsolete 37mm anti-tank guns and firing point-blank at the onrushing steel monsters. But the shells simply bounced off the sloped armor of the T-34 seconds, sparking uselessly as the tanks ground over the gun positions, crushing men and artillery alike. The corset staves that the German High Command had relied upon snapped violently, creating a gaping hole in the Axis line. Panic, contagious and uncontrollable, began to spread through the shattered remnants of the Romanian divisions as the cry of tank echoed down the line. Thousands of men threw away their weapons and fled across the frozen steppe, desperate to escape the crushing treads of the Soviet armor. German liaison officers embedded with the Romanian units tried to stem the tide, drawing their pistols and threatening execution, but they were swept away by the human flood of retreat. The front had not just been broken, it had been obliterated. The Soviet armored columns drove through the wreckage without pausing, their commanders ignoring the pockets of resistance as they raced deep into the German rear, their eyes fixed on the strategic bridge at Kalach. At the Sixth Army headquarters in Golubinsky, the initial reports were confusing and fragmented, filtered through the chaos of severed communications. General Paulus and his chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, initially dismissed the breakthrough as a local attack, a commotion on the flanks that could be contained with local reserves. They were paralyzed by the fog of war, unable to see that the entire strategic map had changed in the span of 3 hours. By the time they realized the magnitude of the disaster, the Soviet spearheads were already 20 miles behind the front line, tearing through the logistical arteries that kept the Sixth Army alive. The sense of security that had enveloped the headquarters vanished, replaced by a cold dread as the sound of artillery grew louder from the north. The only mobile reserve available to stop the avalanche was the German 22nd Panzer Division, a unit that existed largely on paper. When the order came to counterattack, the division was a shadow of a fighting force, having been parked in dugouts for months to conserve fuel. In a bizarre twist of fate that highlighted the logistical neglect, field mice had nested inside the tanks for warmth and chewed through the electrical wiring of the ignition systems. When the crews tried to start their engines, dozens of panzers sat silent and dead, unable to move. The few tanks that did manage to mobilize were sent piecemeal into the blizzard, where they were quickly overwhelmed by the endless waves of Soviet armor, their burning hulks becoming mile markers for the Soviet advance. On November 20, The second jaw of the trap slammed shut south of the city. The Soviet 51st and 57th Armies launched their attack against the Romanian 4th Army, replicating the devastation of the previous day. The terrain here was filled with ravines and lakes, but the freeze had hardened the ground enough for the Soviet mechanized corps to maneuver with terrifying speed. The Romanian defenses collapsed within hours, and the Soviet columns turned northwest, racing to meet their comrades coming from the north. The plan, masterminded by Zhukov and Vasilevsky, was a classic double envelopment, a maneuver the Germans had used to destroy enemy armies earlier in the war, now turned against them with poetic and lethal precision. The German rear areas descended into absolute chaos as the reality of the encirclement became undeniable. Supply columns, workshops, and administrative units, the tail of the army, found themselves suddenly on the front line. Trucks loaded with bread and ammunition were abandoned in snowdrifts as drivers fled on foot, while panicked officers tried to commandeer vehicles at gunpoint. The roads leading west to the Don River became clogged with a mix of fleeing Romanian infantry, German staff cars, and horse-drawn wagons, all struggling through the deepening snow. Soviet aircraft strafed the columns, turning the white landscape into a tableau of burning vehicles and frozen corpses, a highway of death leading nowhere. The critical objective for the closing of the trap was the bridge over the Don River at Kalach, the main supply artery for the entire 6th Army. On the afternoon of November 21, a forward detachment of the Soviet 26th Tank Corps approached the bridge, using captured German tanks and headlights to deceive the guards. The German sentries, assuming it was a training unit returning from the steppes, waved them onto the bridge. Too late. They realized their mistake as the lead tank opened fire, machine gunning the guard post and storming across the span. The Soviets secured the bridge intact, a catastrophic failure of German security that effectively sealed the fate of the army. With Kalach in Soviet hands, the escape route was cut, the door to the cage was locked. General Paulus, realizing his headquarters was in danger of being overrun, ordered a hasty relocation to Nizhny and later to Gumrak, closer to Stalingrad. As his staff cars sped away, he looked out at the burning horizon, the sky lit up by the flares of the approaching enemy. He sent desperate messages to Army Group B, requesting permission to turn his army around and break out to the west before the ring solidified. This was the decisive moment, the only window of opportunity where the 6th Army still had the fuel and the combat power to save itself. But the order never came. Instead, the radio crackled with directives to stand fast, to form a hedgehog position, and to wait for further orders from the Führer. On November 23, near the village of Sovetski, the tanks of the Southwest Front met the tanks of the Stalingrad Front. The soldiers climbed out of their hatches, embracing each other in the snow, sharing vodka and tossing their caps into the air in jubilation. The ring was closed. The encirclement, known in German military terminology as the Kessel or cauldron, was now a reality. Inside this pocket, an area roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep, lay the entire German 6th Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, and the remnants of 2 Romanian armies. Nearly 300,000 men, thousands of horses, and mountains of equipment were now trapped, cut off from the rest of the Wehrmacht by a wall of Soviet steel. Inside the city of Stalingrad, the frontline troops were initially unaware of the catastrophe unfolding in their rear. They were still fighting for individual rooms in the factory district, their world narrowed to the sights of their rifles. When the news finally trickled down to the foxholes, "We are surrounded," it was met with a mix of disbelief and grim humor. The soldiers, veterans of 3 years of victory, could not conceive that the German army could be trapped. They believed that the encirclement was temporary, a mistake that Manstein or Hoth would fix within days. They checked their ammunition pouches and looked at the grey sky, trusting in the infallibility of their leadership, unaware that they had just become prisoners in an open-air camp. Hitler's reaction to the news was immediate and delusional. He viewed the encirclement not as a tactical disaster, but as a temporary setback that could be turned into a fortress. He designated Stalingrad as a Festung fortress, declaring that the 6th Army would hold its position and tie down Soviet forces while a relief operation was mounted. He refused to listen to his generals who urged a breakout, seeing retreat as a personal affront. In his mind, the Sixth Army was not trapped, it was the anvil upon which the Red Army would be broken. This decision, born of ego and a refusal to face reality, condemned hundreds of thousands of men to a slow, freezing death. The Romanian tragedy within the Kessel was particularly bitter. The German soldiers, looking for a scapegoat, blamed their allies for the collapse, spitting on them as they retreated into the German lines. The Romanians, who had warned of the danger for weeks, were now trapped alongside their accusers, starving and without winter clothing. They were relegated to digging trenches and performing manual labor, treated as second-class citizens in a society of the doomed. The camaraderie of the crusade against Bolshevism evaporated, replaced by a primal struggle for survival, where every man looked out for his own ration card and his own warmth. As the sun set on November 23, the trap was absolute. The Soviet outer perimeter was rapidly being reinforced, digging in to repel any relief attempt. While the inner perimeter squeezed tighter around the trapped Germans, the temperature continued to plummet, the wind howling across the steppe like a banshee. The Sixth Army, the conqueror of Paris and Kiev, was now a besieged garrison in the middle of the Russian wasteland. The men of the Sixth Army zipped their jackets tighter and looked west, towards a homeland that suddenly felt very far away. The trap had snapped shut, and the long, dark winter of Stalingrad had truly begun. The doom of the Sixth Army was sealed not on the frozen battlefield, but in the warm, wood-panelled conference room of the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps. General Paulus, realizing the catastrophic nature of the encirclement, had radioed a desperate request to Hitler for permission to break out to the southwest while his tanks still had fuel. The logic was irrefutable. The army could not survive in the open steppe without supplies, and a retreat was the only way to save the manpower for future battles. However, Adolf Hitler, tracing the lines on the map with a trembling hand, saw things differently. To him, the Volga was not just a river but a mystical boundary of German conquest, and to retreat from it was an admission of defeat that his ego could not abide. On November 24, the Führer issued his final, fatal directive. The Sixth Army was to stand fast, form a fortress Stalingrad, and wait for relief. This suicidal order was made possible by the intervention of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The head of the Luftwaffe, sensing an opportunity to regain his waning prestige after the failures of the Battle of Britain, Göring made a promise that was criminal in its negligence. He assured Hitler that his air force could supply the trapped army by air, creating an air bridge that would keep the soldiers fed and armed until the siege could be broken. He based this boast on the successful airlift at the Demyansk pocket the previous winter, ignoring the critical fact that the Sixth Army was 5 times larger and the Soviet air defenses were infinitely stronger. The army required a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day just to survive, a figure that the Luftwaffe logistics experts knew was mathematically impossible to achieve. The reality of the airlift was a disaster from the very first day. To transport 500 tons daily, the Luftwaffe needed hundreds of Ju-52 transport planes flying round the clock, missions in perfect weather. Instead, they had a ragtag fleet of Heinkel bombers converted for transport and aging, Ju-52 seconds, flying into the teeth of the worst Russian winter in decades. The pilots were forced to fly through blizzards, blinding fog, and a wall of Soviet anti-aircraft fire that earned the flight corridor the nickname Die Schlauch, or the hose. Planes were shot down by the dozen, their burning wreckage littering the snowy steppe like grim markers on a highway to hell. On most days, the delivery was less than 100 tons, a fraction of what was needed to keep 300,000 men alive. The focal point of this tragedy was the Pitomnik airfield, a flat stretch of frozen steppe inside the cauldron that became the army's only link to the outside world. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno, a chaotic landscape of wrecked fuselages, screaming wounded, and desperate men. As the transport planes touched down, sliding on the icy runway, they were immediately mobbed by soldiers desperate to unload the cargo and load the wounded. The turnaround times had to be minutes, as Soviet fighters were constantly prowling overhead, ready to strafe the sitting ducks. The ground crews worked with frost-bitten fingers, pumping fuel and dragging crates of ammunition, their movements slowed by exhaustion and the numbing cold that settled into their bones. For the wounded soldiers waiting at Pitomnik, The airfield was both a beacon of hope and a place of agonizing death. Thousands of men, wrapped in bloody bandages and dirty rags, lay in the snow along the runway, waiting for a spot on a departing plane. The rule was that only the walking wounded or those with a special pass could evacuate, leading to heartbreaking scenes of bribery and despair. Men would cling to the landing gear of taking off planes, only to fall to their deaths moments later. Others simply froze to death where they lay, their bodies stiffening into statues of misery, ignored by the living who were too focused on their own survival to care for the dead. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad and the dugouts on the steppe, the spectre of starvation began to stalk the Sixth Army. The daily ration was slashed repeatedly, eventually dropping to a mere slice of bread and a bowl of watery soup per day. This was no ordinary bread. It was a foul concoction of rye, sawdust, and fillers designed to fill the stomach without providing nutrition. The soldiers, burning thousands of calories just to stay warm in the sub-zero temperatures, began to waste away. Their uniforms hung loosely on their skeletal frames, their cheeks became hollow, and their eyes took on a glassy, vacant look known as the Stalingrad stare. The hunger was a constant, gnawing physical pain that dominated every waking thought, overriding duty, discipline, and fear. As the food supplies vanished, the army turned to its horses for survival. The Sixth Army had entered Russia with thousands of horses for transport and artillery, and now these faithful animals became the primary food source. They were slaughtered by the hundreds, their frozen meat hacked apart with bayonets and boiled into a grey, stringy broth. Even the marrow was sucked from the bones, and the hooves were boiled for gelatin. When the horses were gone, the soldiers hunted local dogs, cats, and even rats. Rumors of cannibalism began to circulate in the darkest corners of the cauldron, stories of flesh cut from the frozen dead, though most men clung to the last shreds of their humanity, choosing to starve rather than cross that final taboo. The cold was an enemy as relentless and deadly as the Red Army. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, a killing freeze that turned metal brittle and flesh black. Without winter clothing, the German soldiers wrapped themselves in anything they could find: curtains looted from Russian homes, women's fur coats, blankets stolen from the dead. Frostbite became an epidemic, turning toes and fingers gangrenous, necessitating amputations without anesthetic in filth-ridden field hospitals. To stay warm, men burned furniture, books, and even the floorboards of the bunkers they lived in. The lack of fuel meant that tanks could not run and bunkers could not be heated, leaving the army paralyzed and shivering in the dark. The lice infestation added a layer of torment to the freezing misery. Every soldier was covered in thousands of lice that lived in the seams of their uniforms, feeding on their blood and transmitting typhus. The itching was maddening, a constant torture that prevented sleep and drove men to the brink of insanity. Soldiers would spend hours shirt hunting, cracking the lice between their fingernails. But it was a futile task. The typhus epidemic swept through the weakened ranks, killing thousands who were already at death's door from starvation. The field hospitals became charnel houses where the sick lay on the floor in their own filth, waiting for a death that came as a mercy. Christmas of 1942 was the psychological breaking point for many in the cauldron. The Nazi propaganda machine back in Berlin broadcast a special program, fabricating a live connection to the frontline heroes of Stalingrad, complete with fake singing and cheerful messages. In reality, the mood in the bunkers was one of somber mourning. Soldiers huddled around tiny Hindenburg lights, candles made of fat and rags singing Silent Night with tears freezing on their faces. They opened their last packages from home, reading letters from wives and mothers who had no idea their sons were already ghosts. The contrast between the warmth of memory and the freezing reality of the Kessel broke the hearts of even the most hardened veterans. It was during this dark Christmas that Dr. Kurt Ruber, a physician and pastor serving in the pocket, drew the famous Stalingrad Madonna. On the back of a captured Russian map, he sketched a simple image of the Virgin Mary cradling the infant Jesus, wrapped in a protective cloak. Around the drawing, he wrote the words, light, life, love. This image became an icon for the trapped men, a symbol of spiritual solace in a world that had been stripped of all hope and mercy. Men crowded into Ruber's bunker to gaze at the drawing, finding a moment of peace amidst the horror. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit, a flicker of light in the absolute darkness of the entrapment. The lie of the airlift finally collapsed in late December as the Soviets overran the main supply bases outside the pocket. The airfield at Tatsinskaya, the primary hub for the Ju-52 seconds, was captured by a Soviet tank raid on Christmas Eve. The German transport pilots were forced to take off in a panic as T-34 seconds rolled onto the runway, crushing planes and equipment. With the loss of the forward airfields, the flight distance increased, and the tonnage dropped to virtually nothing. The promise of Goering was revealed for what it was, a cynical deception that had condemned an entire army to destruction. The soldiers in the Kessel looked up at the grey sky, but no planes came. Discipline began to fray as the realization of abandonment set in. The rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht dissolved into small groups of men bonded by survival. Officers who could no longer feed their men lost their authority, while natural leaders emerged from the ranks based on their ability to scrounge food or find warmth. Deserters began to wander the ruins, hiding in cellars, answering to no one. The concept of comradeship, once the glue of the army, was tested to its limits. While some men shared their last crust of bread, others stole from the weak or hoarded supplies. The veneer of civilization was wearing thin, revealing the primal instincts of men pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The fortress Stalingrad was no fortress. It was a graveyard. The perimeter was shrinking daily as the Soviets probed the weak spots, compressing the trapped mass of humanity into an ever smaller killing zone. The artillery fire from the Red Army was relentless, churning the snow and earth into a moonscape of craters. There was no ammunition to return fire, no fuel to maneuver, and no strength to counterattack. The Sixth Army was a dying beast, trapped in a cage, bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The soldiers knew, with a terrible clarity, that no one was coming to save them. They were alone in the ice, abandoned by their Führer, waiting for the end. As the new year of 1943 began, the silence from Berlin was deafening. There were no more promises of relief, no more talk of victory. The only orders were to fight to the last round, to commit suicide rather than surrender. General Paulus, sitting in the basement of the Uvermag department store, which now served as his headquarters, stared blankly at the wall. He had obeyed every order, followed every directive, and in doing so, he had led his men into the abyss. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht had died in the snow of Stalingrad, buried under the lies of an airlift that never existed. The only question that remained was how long the agony would last before the final curtain fell. December 1942 arrived with a vengeance, burying the southern Russian steppe under deep drifts of snow and plunging the temperature to levels that froze oil in engine blocks. Inside the Kessel, the starving men of the Sixth Army clung to a single, fragile thread of hope: Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Manstein was widely considered the Wehrmacht's most brilliant operational mind, the architect of the victory in France, and Hitler had given him command of the newly formed Army Group Don with the express mission of saving the trapped army. The code name for the relief operation was Unternehmen Wintergewitter, or Operation Winterstorm. To the frozen soldiers huddled in their ice-crusted dugouts, Manstein was not just a general, he was a messianic figure, the only man capable of performing the miracle that would lead them out of the valley of the shadow of death. The strike force assembled for this desperate rescue mission was the 4th Panzer Army, commanded by General Colonel Hermann Hoth. It was a formidable collection of steel, spearheaded by the fresh 6th Panzer Division, which had been transferred from France, and the battle-hardened 17th and 23rd Panzer Divisions. These crews were well rested, their tanks were fully fueled, and they burned with a fierce determination to save their comrades trapped in the cauldron. As they assembled near Kotelnikovo, south of the pocket, the crews painted their tanks in winter whitewash and checked their guns. They knew the odds were stacked against them, facing deep Soviet defenses and treacherous terrain. But the knowledge that 300,000 German soldiers were waiting for them provided a potent motivation. On December 12, Operation Winterstorm unleashed its fury. Hoth's panzers roared forward across the frozen steppe, smashing into the Soviet 51st Army with the force of a sledgehammer. The initial progress was surprisingly rapid, as the superior German tactics and gunnery tore holes in the Soviet defensive lines. The 6th Panzer Division, equipped with the long-barreled Panzer IVs and a company of the new, heavy Tiger tanks, proved to be an unstoppable force in the open country. They rolled over Soviet anti-tank positions and scattered infantry formations, driving steadily northward toward the pocket. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed that the German mastery of mobile warfare would triumph once again, slicing through the encirclement like a scalpel. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the sound of distant artillery fire from the south acted like an electric shock to the morale of the doomed garrison. Soldiers climbed out of their holes, straining their ears against the wind to catch the dull thud of the guns, which grew louder with each passing day. "Manstein is coming" was the whisper that passed from foxhole to foxhole, igniting a desperate euphoria. Men who had been resigned to death suddenly found the will to live, cleaning their weapons and checking their boots, preparing for the moment when they would link up with the relief force. They believed that the nightmare was almost over, that the doors of the cage were about to be kicked open by their brothers in arms. However, the Soviet reaction to the relief attempt was swift and calculated. Marshal Vasilevsky, overseeing the operation from Moscow, recognized the danger immediately. If Manstein broke through to the Sixth Army, the great victory of the encirclement would be undone, and the Germans would regain the initiative in the south. With Stalin's approval, Vasilevsky made a critical strategic decision. He diverted the powerful Second Guards Army, commanded by the rugged General Rodion Malinovsky, from its planned offensive against the Italian Eighth Army. This massive force, comprised of fresh elite troops and heavy tanks, was thrown directly into the path of Hoth's advancing panzers. The race was on. Could Hoth reach the pocket before Malinovsky's wall of steel solidified? The collision between the 4th Panzer Army and the 2nd Guards Army took place on the banks of the Myshkova River, the last natural barrier before Stalingrad. For days, a savage tank battle raged in the snow, a swirling melee of fire and iron where burning hulks littered the white landscape. The German crews fought with desperate skill, destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks, but for every T-34 they knocked out, 2 more seemed to appear from the mist. The sheer numerical superiority of the Red Army began to tell, grinding the German advance to a halt. Hoth's division commanders reported that they were running low on ammunition and fuel, their strength sapped by the ceaseless combat against a seemingly inexhaustible enemy. By December 19, the lead elements of the 6th Panzer Division had reached the town of Verkhneykumsky, just 30 miles from the perimeter of the Stalingrad pocket. At night, the German tank crews could see the flares rising from the besieged city, flickering ghostly lights on the northern horizon. They were so close that they could almost feel the presence of their trapped comrades. Inside the pocket, the soldiers watched the same flares. Weeping with frustration, the relief force was visible, tantalizingly close, yet separated by a solid wall of Soviet defenses that the exhausted relief force could no longer penetrate on its own. The gap had to be closed from the inside. The Sixth Army had to break out to meet them. This was the decisive moment of the entire tragedy, the point where history held its breath. Manstein knew that Hoth could go no further, and that the Sixth Army had to launch Operation Thunderclap Donnerschlag, a breakout attack to link up with the relief force. Manstein sent his intelligence officer, Major Eismann, into the pocket to convince Paulus to disobey Hitler's stand, fast order, and attack southward. The plan was clear: abandon the city, destroy all heavy equipment that could not be moved, and punch through the Soviet ring to reach Hoth's tanks on the Myshkova. It was a risky maneuver that would result in heavy casualties, but the alternative was the total annihilation of the army. General Paulus, however, remained paralyzed by his own rigid adherence to orders and the domineering influence of his chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt. When Eismann presented the plan, Paulus and Schmidt argued that they did not have enough fuel to move their tanks the 20 miles necessary to breach the Soviet lines. They claimed the army was too weak to move, citing the lack of horses and the exhaustion of the men. But the true reason was deeper. Paulus could not bring himself to disobey a direct order from the Führer. He was a man who believed in the chain of command above all else, and without explicit permission from Berlin to abandon Fortress Stalingrad, he refused to move. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that Hitler, far away in East Prussia, remained delusional about the situation. He insisted that the Sixth Army could hold Stalingrad and be relieved, refusing to authorize a breakout that would involve giving up the city. He promised more supplies, more air support, more miracles, none of which were grounded in reality. Manstein tried to subtly authorize the breakout on his own authority, sending ambiguous messages to Paulus, urging him to act as the situation demands. But Paulus refused to take the hint. He wanted a signed order, a piece of paper that would absolve him of responsibility. In waiting for that paper, he condemned his army to death. While Paulus dithered and Hoth stalled, the Soviets unleashed their masterstroke on the wider strategic front. On December 16, they launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive against the Italian Eighth Army guarding the Don River northwest of Stalingrad. As with the Romanians a month earlier, the Italian lines disintegrated under the weight of the Soviet armor. The collapse was total and catastrophic. Soviet tank columns poured through the gap, racing south toward Rostov and the Sea of Azov. This move threatened to cut off not just the relief force, but the entire Army Group Don and Army Group A in the Caucasus. If the Soviets reached Rostov, 1 million German soldiers would be trapped. Field Marshal von Manstein was now faced with a terrible dilemma that no commander should ever have to face. If he kept Hoth's tanks on the Mishkova River trying to save the Sixth Army, the Soviet flank attack would encircle his own forces, and the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front would collapse. The mathematics of war were cold and unforgiving. To save the army group, he had to abandon the Sixth Army. On December 23, Manstein ordered the 6th Panzer Division to disengage from the relief effort and rush west to plug the hole left by the Italians. The rescue mission was over. The withdrawal of the relief force was a moment of supreme anguish for the tank crews of the 4th Panzer Army. As they turned their vehicles around and began to drive away from Stalingrad, they looked back at the horizon where the flares were still rising. They knew they were leaving their comrades to die. The radio operators sent final messages of encouragement, but the silence that followed was heavy with guilt. Inside the pocket, the soldiers watching from the trenches saw the muzzle flashes of the relief force recede and then disappear. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The door had slammed shut, and the key had been thrown away. The psychological impact on the trapped men was devastating. For weeks, they had sustained themselves on the rumor of salvation, enduring the starvation and the cold because they believed Manstein was coming. Now, that hope was extinguished. The fortress was not a strategic position, it was a death camp. The Christmas of 1942 became a wake for the living. Men stopped cleaning their weapons, they stopped shaving, they stopped caring. The discipline that had held the army together began to crack under the weight of absolute despair. They were no longer fighting for victory or for the Führer, they were fighting for a few more hours of life. The failure of Operation Winter Storm marked the end of the Sixth Army as a fighting force capable of strategic maneuver. From this point on, their only role was to serve as a breakwater, dying slowly to tie down Soviet troops while Manstein frantically tried to stabilize the front hundreds of miles to the west. Paulus, the obedient soldier, had gotten his wish. He had held his position. He sat in his dark cellar, surrounded by maps that no longer mattered, listening to the relentless pounding of the Soviet artillery tightening the noose. The opportunity to break out had existed for a fleeting moment in history, but it had been squandered by indecision and blind loyalty. As the year 1942 bled into 1943, the steppe was silent except for the wind and the guns. The Sixth Army was alone in the ice, a ghost army waiting for the final blow. The soldiers dug deeper into the frozen earth, hugging the ground that would soon be their grave. They wrote their final letters, many of which would never be delivered, pouring out their bitterness and their love. The relief force was gone. The airlift was a lie. The food was gone. All that remained was the waiting, and the terrible knowledge that the end was drawing near. January 1943 arrived, not with the promise of a new year, but with the chilling certainty of the end. The German Sixth Army, once the proud spearhead of the Wehrmacht, was now a tattered collection of starving scarecrows huddled in the ruins of the steppe. On January 8, the Soviet commander of the Don Front, General Konstantin Rokossovsky, offered honorable surrender terms to General Paulus, The offer promised medical attention for the wounded, rations for the hungry, and the retention of medals and uniforms. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, a chance to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. However, the order from the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia was instantaneous, and absolute surrender was forbidden. Paulus, trapped by his oath and his lack of moral courage, rejected the ultimatum. The radio silence that followed was the death knell for the men in the pocket. On the morning of January 10, the Soviet answer arrived in the form of Operation Ring. The horizon erupted as 7,000 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously, a bombardment of such intensity that it shattered the frozen earth and buried entire battalions in their bunkers. The German defensive perimeter, already thin and brittle, shattered under the impact. The Soviet tanks, supported by waves of infantry in winter camouflage, rolled over the outer defenses, crushing the emaciated defenders who lacked the strength to lift their rifles. There was no grand tactical maneuvering anymore. This was a methodical, crushing compression of the pocket, driving the Germans relentlessly backward toward the ruins of the city they had destroyed. As the perimeter collapsed, the horror at the airfields reached its crescendo. Pitomnik, the primary lifeline, fell on January 16, forcing the entire logistics operation to shift to the smaller, primitive airstrip at Gumrak. The scenes witnessed here were among the most grotesque of the entire war. Panic stripped away the last veneer of military discipline as thousands of wounded and desperate men swarmed the few remaining transport planes. Soldiers clung to the landing gear of taking off due 52 seconds, only to lose their grip and fall to their deaths from hundreds of feet in the air. Inside the planes, men trampled each other to secure a space, while field police used rifle butts to beat back the mob. When the last plane lifted off from Gumrak under heavy Soviet tank fire on January 21, it left behind a landscape of abandoned wounded, screaming in the snow, knowing they had been left to die. With the loss of the airfields, the Sixth Army was effectively decapitated. There would be no more food, no more ammunition, and no more hope of evacuation. The starvation entered its terminal phase. Men were now dying by the hundreds every hour, not from enemy fire, but from heart failure caused by extreme malnutrition and exposure. Soldiers gnawed on leather belts and boiled boot leather in a desperate attempt to fill their stomachs. The stiff bodies of the dead were stacked like cordwood outside the bunkers to act as windbreaks, their frozen limbs serving the living one last time. The line between the living and the dead had blurred. The survivors moved with the slow, jerky motions of automatons, their eyes wide and unseeing, focused only on the next minute of survival. The retreat forced the Germans back into the ruins of Stalingrad itself, completing a grim circle of irony. The soldiers were now defending the very rubble they had fought so hard to conquer months earlier. The cellars and basements of the city became the final strongholds, fetid dens crowded with typhus-ridden men, lice, and the stench of gangrene. The Highways Russian volunteers who had joined the German army faced the bleakest fate of all, knowing they would be executed as traitors by the Soviets. They fought with the ferocity of the damned or were shot by their German masters to save rations. The city was a charnel house, a labyrinth of death where the only sound was the howling wind and the approaching rattle of Soviet submachine guns. By late January, the pocket had been split into two isolated pockets, a southern group in the city centre commanded by Paulus, and a northern group in the factory district under General Karl Strecker. Discipline disintegrated completely. Officers ripped the rank insignia from their shoulders to blend in with the enlisted men. Suicide became epidemic. The pistol shot in the dark became a familiar sound in the bunkers. Some soldiers, driven mad by the stress, walked openly into the Soviet lines to be shot. Others raided the supply depots for the last stocks of alcohol, schnapps, choosing to meet the end in a drunken stupor. The once mighty Sixth Army had ceased to function as a military organization. It was now just a mass of suffering humanity waiting for the end. On January 30, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hermann Goering broadcast a speech over the radio to the dying troops. He compared the Sixth Army to the ancient Spartans at Thermopylae, declaring that they were dying so that Germany might live. To the soldiers shivering in the cellars, listening to the broadcast on dying batteries, this speech was a grotesque insult. They knew they were not heroes saving the fatherland. They were victims of a criminal incompetence, sacrificed for the ego of a dictator. Bitter curses were shouted at the radio sets. They did not want to be Spartans. They wanted to go home. The disconnect between the propaganda in Berlin and the reality in the cellars of Stalingrad was absolute. The final act of the tragedy played out in the basement of the Univermag department store, which served as Paulus's headquarters. On January 30, Hitler sent a radio message promoting Paulus to the rank of General Feldmarschall Field Marshal. The message carried a dark, unspoken implication in the history of the Prussian and German military. No field marshal had ever been taken prisoner alive. Hitler was effectively ordering Paulus to commit suicide to preserve the honor of the army. Paulus, holding the promotion order in his trembling hands, looked at the paper with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. He reportedly remarked, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." The promotion, intended to trigger a suicide, instead broke Paulus's final bond of loyalty. On the morning of January 31, 1943, Soviet soldiers from the 64th Army surrounded the Uvermag building. Lieutenant Fyodor Yelchenko, a young Soviet officer, descended into the dark, foul-smelling basement. There, in a small room lit by a flickering candle, he found the newly promoted field marshal lying on a camp bed, unshaven and exhausted. The contrast was stark: the young, victorious Soviet lieutenant and the broken, aging commander of the German 6th Army. There was no fanaticism left, only exhaustion. Paulus did not draw his pistol. He simply surrendered. The southern pocket had fallen. The myth of the German Superman died in that dim basement, surrendering to the subhuman enemy he had been sent to destroy. In the northern pocket, General Strecker held out for 2 more days in the ruins of the tractor factory, believing that every hour he fought tied down Soviet troops that could otherwise attack other sectors of the front. But it was a futile gesture. On February 2, Strecker radioed his final message: "The 11th Corps has done its duty." The guns finally fell silent. A strange, deafening silence descended over the city of Stalingrad for the first time in 5 months. The smoke drifted slowly over the Volga, revealing a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The battle was over. The Wehrmacht had suffered its greatest defeat in history, losing an entire field army and shattering the aura of invincibility that had terrified the world. The aftermath was a spectacle of biblical misery. From the ruins emerged the survivors' 91,000 German soldiers, along with thousands of Romanians and Italians. They stumbled out into the blinding white snow, a column of ghosts wrapped in rags, blankets, and pieces of carpet. They were a pathetic sight, barely recognizable as human beings. They were marched east, across the frozen steppe, into a captivity that would prove to be as deadly as the battle itself. As they marched, they passed the frozen bodies of their comrades, the wrecked tanks, and the mountains of equipment that littered the road. The Soviet soldiers watched them pass, their anger tempered by the sheer scale of the suffering they were witnessing. The march of the dead to the prisoner camps was brutal. Those who fell behind were shot or left to freeze. Typhus, dysentery, and starvation continued to cull the ranks long after the shooting stopped. The Soviet Union, itself devastated by the war and facing famine, had little food or medicine to spare for the invaders who had burned their country. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The vast majority died in camps in Siberia and Central Asia, victims of the war they had started. It would be 1,955, more than a decade later, before the last few survivors returned home to a country that had changed forever. The defeat at Stalingrad was the psychological turning point of World War II. It was not just a military disaster, it was a shock that shook the foundations of the Third Reich. For the first time, the German public realized that the war could be lost. The scale of the loss: hundreds of thousands of sons, fathers, and husbands vanishing into the void, could not be hidden by propaganda. The momentum of the war had shifted irrevocably. The Red Army, having learned the hard lessons of blood, began its inexorable march westward, a march that would not stop until it reached Berlin. The shadow of Stalingrad would hang over the German army for the rest of the war, a symbol of hubris and inevitable doom. In the end, Stalingrad remains a monument to the endurance of the human spirit and the insanity of war. It was a battle where the irresistible force met the immovable object, and the cost was paid in millions of lives. The city was eventually rebuilt, rising from the ashes, but the bones of the dead still lie shallow beneath the steppe, a silent reminder of the winter of 1942. For the Sixth Army, there was no glory, only the wind blowing across the endless Russian snow, whispering the names of the lost. The trap had claimed them all.